We continue our look at Van Gogh's work in Arles, and again, a lot of this, or the majority of the work that we're looking at right now, is not only some of the most famous work by Vincent Van Gogh, but again, this is all kind of meant to be constructed as decorations for the Yellow House as much as anything. Again, but if you think about it, what he's really doing during this time period is he's really mastering his style and his particular technique before Gauguin actually arrives. When we look at this, we see one of the first instances of him painting the night sky. And again, we've talked about this when we had our lecture on James Whistler, that there just aren't a lot of artists that attempt this, because, you know, what does the night actually look like? It's a very easy thing to imagine, but a very difficult thing to actually paint or draw without just having a blackness across the entire screen. Again, this is the time when we have paintings like the Night Cafe, very famously made in Vincent's own words as this kind of lecherous place that you might find, a place to lose one's mind, if you will. And again, when we look at the colors he's using in this incredibly, what I refer to as murder red type of color, where it's just this red intensity, and of course relying once again on his complementaries, using green in comparison to that red, making both of them very, very extraordinarily vibrant. We see the green on the ceiling, but also on the felt on the table. This is also one of the first paintings that we notice him kind of drawing what light looks like. And again, when we think about this, you know, from the capacity of the sun or something else, it's a difficult image. This is Starry Night, but not the Starry Night that most of us are used to. This is an earlier painting that he did along the same thematic that most people aren't aware of. Again, it doesn't have those thick swirls that we're used to seeing with Van Gogh. With this, it's more of a patchwork of flat. We can kind of see the texture in the sky itself. You hear these amazingly crazy stories about him painting that are probably fictitious, that he wore a hat that had candles on it or something like that. Again, if you think about the practical aspects of this, it would be almost impossible for someone to have something like that. For no other reason, you would have hot wax dripping on you all of the time while you were painting. But again, we have kind of predecessors to the Starry Night. That's one of them. Here we have flowering gardens, and again, just a wonderful example of the work done during this period. And it's very interesting if we look at how he's actually doing the flowers in the right corner there. What we have is we have a flat patch of color of this green, and then he's kind of gone over the top and made these patterned almost heart shapes to kind of fill in the balance, where we see the green as being both aspects of the background and the flowers themselves. And then as we transition over, we get into more of a pointillist feel with these larger red dots. Again, when we look at the complexity of colors and also the complexity of application of paint, there's a good reason why this is considered Vincent Van Gogh's most flourishing period. Another image of a garden, again, showing the difference in texture and tonality. Again, when we look at the way he's doing those dash marks to make the garden itself, but then we see these same kind of longer lines in the background making these roof shingles, if you will. Again, showing how he can do both in the same proximity, giving us a harder kind of man-made vehicle in comparison to the wonderful garden that he is, of course, witnessing in front of him. Again, strong use of the color yellow permeates throughout most of the work. We see it along this large L, if you will, backwards L, from the right corner leading us across to the bottom of the left, really making this wonderful color balance. Paul Gauguin finally arrives in Arles around October 23rd, and I say finally because this is several months after he had mentioned that he would actually come out to this location. And as the story goes, Theo, Vincent's brother, essentially had to bribe him, offer him various things, including an artist's salary, in order for him to actually go out and live at this location. And again, we have to remember it's a very, very short amount of time that these two actually live with each other, and it never really worked out well from my understanding. We don't have a lot of direct input into what was occurring, but we get this idea that Gauguin kind of came as the master, and Vincent van Gogh was supposed to be the student, but by then Vincent van Gogh had very much mastered his own techniques and wanted to be seen as an equal, and we get into this entire conversation between these two very quickly here. Self-portrait dedicated to Paul Gauguin. This is a painting made for him, and again, when we look at this, we kind of think of this is the Japanese monk version of Vincent van Gogh, if you will. Very, very short cropped hair, almost looking spiritual. So again, going back to the conversation between these two artists, the main point of the conversation really gets down to this. Paul Gauguin was very much professing this idea that you should look away from nature, that you should kind of synthesize it. And again, when we think of people affecting Gauguin like Emile Bernard, this is kind of in this route of thinking that there's this spiritual energy almost that you would capture in paint. Red Vineyards at Arles. This is actually quite a famous painting in the connection to Vincent van Gogh. This is one of the few paintings he actually sold. Red Vineyards at Arles in 1888. If nothing else, it's a good answer to a trivia question. I've kind of arranged these works from this period that I think are kind of influenced by Gauguin or Gauguin's style. Again, this Cloisonnism that we're familiar with if you heard the lecture of Gauguin in Tahiti. Again, back to the conversation. While Gauguin wanted to look away from nature, Vincent had very much the opposite approach. If you look at Vincent van Gogh's work, there's very few images where he's not looking at nature directly, and he's kind of adjusting it in a little bit to his own perspective. But again, I'm not 100% sure that this was done during the time period, but when you look at his work in Arles, this is a very Gauguin-styled Van Gogh painting to me. Again, when you look at this, you could almost make a nice little stained glass window out of it with these larger packets of color that, again, we associate more with Gauguin than Vincent van Gogh. So again, Vincent wanted to look at nature. He took this as his great muse at this time, if you will, and this was kind of the root of their conversation or argument. Again, these are two incredibly difficult people, so it's hard to imagine that they would have gotten along at all. Again, and even from very early on, Vincent has this manifest paranoia that Gauguin is simply just going to leave the artist colony. And again, when we think about this in proximity to what's occurring, we hear different stories. Again, Ladies of Arles, to me, this is a very Gauguin-influenced subject matter. If you look at it, it looks much more like a Gauguin than even a Vincent van Gogh. We even have this somewhat Brittany type of person sitting in the corner. Again, it didn't work out. Long story short is really the point we're getting to. There were stories that Paul Gauguin would wake up in the middle of the night and Vincent would be in his room just staring at him, you know, that type of thing, not making an incredibly comfortable environment for Gauguin. But of course, Gauguin was notorious for being incredibly difficult to get along with as well. So really what we have here is two of the most difficult people imaginable trying to share one tiny space and really push each other about what art should be. So we get to the famous event of December 23rd, and this is actually a newspaper article that we have that talks about the event. And again, in the reality, we don't know what actually occurs. We hear this story that Vincent van Gogh confronts Paul Gauguin in the streets. hands him a piece of newspaper. The newspaper says, of course, in French, the murderer has fled. And then Vincent van Gogh goes home and essentially cuts off his hair. Gauguin does not go home that night. As the story goes, he went and found a hotel room. Sometime during the night, Vincent van Gogh went to the local brothel and gave his ear to a woman named Rachel, saying something to the effect of, "Hold on to this, I will be famous one day," or something along those lines. But we don't really know, and the reality is, with all of the stipulations that we have in it, we have so many different stories around it. That's probably the most popular version and what's kind of told in the narrative of the police tale. Again, it's a very difficult story to kind of pull apart if you think about all of the members that are actually in it. We have different accounts that Gauguin might have chopped off the ear. We also hear from Gauguin that the ear was actually left to him by the postman rather than given to a prostitute at all. What we do know, the reality is that Vincent did cut off his ear, and he finds his way to the hospital at Arles. Very, very shortly after that, Gauguin essentially just leaves Arles altogether. But it's interesting because we actually have a perspective inside of the hospital ward from the time that Vincent was there. And we also have a perspective out into the courtyard itself. Now, what occurs is essentially we have Gauguin leaving. Vincent van Gogh does not stay very long in the hospital at Arles. He goes back to the Yellow House and he continues to paint for a short amount of time. He then has, different bouts of insanity, if you will, and at various times needs to actually go back to the hospital at Arles. And again, this is creating what you would only imagine to be a very bad reputation for Vincent van Gogh. And it even reaches a point, it is said that the locals essentially work up a petition to have him removed from town because they consider him to be so insane and such a threat, if you will. Again, all of this is kind of culminating into the mentality of Vincent van Gogh at the time. This is always this very sad image in my mind. One of the paintings that we have from Van Gogh when he gets out of the hospital are these two empty chairs. And on the left, we have Van Gogh's chair, of course, with the pipe. And on the right, this would be Gauguin's chair, of course, empty. But Vincent, as you can see, the candle is still burning. He still has some hope or some dream that things will work out. And eventually that this artist colony will manifest into shape. Gauguin does continue correspondence with Vincent van Gogh in the form of letters, but the two actually never do meet each other again in terms of a face-to-face connection. Again, I think that Gauguin had simply had enough of the location. And again, also living with Vincent van Gogh, and also he enjoyed his ego, and there was probably no one there to tell him how wonderful he was. So we, of course, have this self-portrait from 1888. This is obviously done before the fact. We know that because we can see his right ear. But again, if we look at this and we think about the other self-portraits we've looked at in the previous lecture, again, this is really a masterpiece with the way he's forming the texture on the canvas in order to represent himself. One can really just get lost within his coat there, the blue with these little itty-bitty specks of yellow to just really flourish how deep and blue the color really is. And as we move up to his face, it's almost a sense of happiness or not the sorrowful gaze, I guess, that we're so used to seeing with Vincent van Gogh. And here, of course, we have after two paintings done in Arles around 1889. And again, we notice the Japanese print in the background again. And this is, interesting because he actually painted himself with a bandaged ear. As the story goes, as we continue from this point forward, he spends a small amount of time in Arles, but with everything occurring, essentially, he decides it's time to leave that town, and he actually decides at this point that he will commit himself to essentially an insane asylum, a location called St. Paul at Saint-Remy, and we'll look at the work that he does at that location in the next lecture.